Hi guys, my name is Siobhan Fallon. Welcome back to Custer's 7th Cavalry. If you caught my part 1, you'll remember that the half Arikara, half Sioux scout Bloody Knife nursed a lifelong hatred against the Hunkpapa warrior Gall. And no wonder, they were raised in the same village, and Gall just brutally bullied Bloody Knife because of his Arikara blood. But that's just one of the many reasons that they found themselves on opposite sides on June 25th, 1876, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, when Bloody Knife was there with the United States Army and George Custer, and Gall stood on the other side with Sitting Bull and the combined forces of the Lakota and Cheyenne. Let's learn more, guys. Thanks for joining me.
He was called Nasir-Pat in Arikara and Tamina Wawe in Sioux, but history most often records this remarkable man's name as Bloody Knife. It was during the Yellowstone campaign in the summer of 1873 that Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer began to rely on the skills of Bloody Knife. Custer wrote that he was, quote, guided by my favorite scout Bloody Knife, a young Arikara warrior. After this expedition, Custer convinced him to transfer to Custer's command at Fort Abraham Lincoln near Bismarck, North Dakota. Bloody Knife was able to send a message to the Indian agent at Fort Berthold and request that his wife, Owl Woman, be brought to Fort Abraham Lincoln at the first opportunity. And Bloody Knife was needed at Fort Lincoln as the Lakota continued to attack the area. In late 1873, Libby Custer describes a band of Sioux coming to the post with the intent of fighting the Arikara scouts enlisted there. That fight between the Sioux and Arikara lasted all day, with the Arikara finally driving off the enemy. In January 1874, the Sioux arrived at Fort Lincoln to smoke the peace pipe with the Arikara. The Indian Scouts invited the 7th Cavalry officers and their wives to witness the ceremony and the strong heart dance that followed. But this tenuous peace did not last. In April, a Lakota band ran off about 90 mules from Fort Abraham Lincoln. The entire cavalry and the Indian Scouts immediately chased after them, and they were able to get them back. The Arikara were cited in the Bismarck Tribune for this success, with Bloody Knife mentioned by name. It was also around this time, in April 1874, that Gall, along with 2 other Sioux leaders, brought in their bands of 50 lodges to Standing Rock and agreed to live and stay peacefully at the agency. It was common for many of the non-treaty Lakota to go to the agencies on the Great Sioux Reservation and collect U.S. government rations during the difficult winter months, and then return to their hunting grounds on unceded Indian territory in the spring and summer. On May 31, 1874, Arikara scouts spotted a large party of Sioux warriors near Fort Abraham Lincoln. 2 separate detachments of soldiers and scouts were sent after them, but the Sioux disappeared, and both detachments of soldiers, each with more than 100 men, came back empty-handed. Fearing the warriors were on their way to the Three Nations Indian Reservation at Fort Berthold, Custer sent a warning to the agency. General Phil Sheridan himself had said, quote, the Arikara and Mandans should be protected, same as white settlers. Custer's premonition was correct. On June 13, 1874, Sioux warriors attacked the Arikara village. When the Arikara chased them off, pursuing them for about 7 miles, 700 Lakota warriors appeared from behind a ridge. The Arikara were outnumbered more than 4 to 1, but they managed to drive off their enemy, losing 7 Arikara, all of whom were scalped. One of Bloody Knife's sons was supposedly killed in this fight. Another Arikara scout working for the army also lost a brother. Bloody Knife blamed the killings on Gall. But these deaths did not stop the Arikara scouts from joining the Black Hills expedition when it departed from Fort Abraham Lincoln on July 2, 1874. Bloody Knife, surely itching for revenge, served as the chief of Indian Scouts with the rank of corporal, leading the 24 Arikara. The Black Hills were part of the Lakota land and unceded territory granted to them in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The Lakota had seized the Black Hills from the Cheyenne in 1776, but it had long been revered by all of the tribes who lived there and viewed it as sacred. earlier incursions into the Black Hills, be it a surveying party, scientific groups, or miners, had been quickly met by bands of Lakota who guided or chased those parties away. Thus, the Black Hills remained utterly uncharted territory to white eyes. General Sheridan claimed he authorized the expedition in order to establish a military fort near the Black Hills in an effort to control hostile Indian attacks on frontier settlements. And according to the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty that established the Great Sioux Reservation, which included the Black Hills, the Sioux agreed to allow travelers, railroad surveyors, and construction workers to enter their tribal land safely, and also to allow the government to establish posts and roads. So maybe the Army just wanted to put a fort near the Black Hills, but it was long rumored that the Black Hills held gold. The country was in the grip of the Panic of 1873. The panic had been triggered by a railroad and bank crisis, creating a severe depression across America. It was actually the original Great Depression. Unemployment and inflation skyrocketed. President Grant was criticized on all fronts, and it's undeniable that a gold rush would help the economy and Grant's administration. In 1874, the Black Hills expedition consisted of more than 1,000 men, including the 16-member 7th Cavalry Military Band with 110 wagons, 3 Gatling guns, a Rodman rifled cannon, 4 scientists, 4 journalists, 2 engineers, and a photographer. There were even 2 experienced miners who joined the expedition, but the record of their employment is rather shady. No one knows how miners were included. They may have signed on as teamsters. On July 22nd, it was Bloody Knife who found a small camp of Oglala warriors, and the Arikara scouts surrounded it. Custer and his interpreter entered and smoked the peace pipe with the 27 warriors. One of the Oglala was the son-in-law of Chief Red Cloud. Custer thought he convinced the men to serve as his guides on the expedition, and he plied them with gifts. But that night, while setting up camp, all of the warriors escaped save one, an older Oglala named One Stab. One Stab thought he was fated to be killed by the Arikara scouts, and the Arikara scouts thought so too. But after a week, Custer freed this last remaining Sioux. Bloody Knife was furious. When our Arikara found out that One Stab was indeed gone and out of their reach, Bloody Knife slunk to the rear of the marching column and scarce spoke a word all day except to say he was ashamed and disappointed. Tempers continued to run high. According to the Arikara scout Young Hawk, in an interview given 30 years later, quote, Charlie Reynolds and Bloody Knife were scouting the trail and the wagons got stuck in a high-cut bank. Custer thought it was Bloody Knife's fault and drew a revolver and shot at them, and Charlie and Bloody Knife saved themselves by dodging behind trees. When Custer put away his gun, Bloody Knife came to where he sat on his horse and said, It is not a good thing you have done to me. If I had been possessed of madness too, you would not see another day. And Custer replied, My brother, it was the madness of the moment that made me do this, but it is gone now. Let us shake hands and be friends again. So Bloody Knife agreed, and they shook hands. Whatever their small annoyances may have been, Custer wrote his wife Libby, Bloody Knife is doing splendidly. I gotta say, Bloody Knife must have been a distinguished person, or at least incredibly photogenic, because not only do we have numerous photos of him during the Yellowstone campaign of the previous summer, such as these 3 famous images here, but he is included in so many of the photos from the Black Hills expedition as well. Personally, I think the fact that he was asked to pose so often shows his place of importance. Here he is in this group photo of the officers and the scientific corps. Let's zoom in a little bit. And here he is with 2 other Arikara scouts. That's Bloody Knife pointing at Custer's map. And another, here he is again, after having helped Custer take down a grizzly bear. But even more important than having the boss let you take a bunch of photos with them Is Bloody Knife being recognized and rewarded for his hard work? Custer requested a bonus. He wrote to Army headquarters that Bloody Knife was, quote, unceasing in his daily efforts. He frequently encountered unusual dangers, being required to furnish his own horse. His extraordinary labors in looking for routes far in advance of the expedition rendered his horse useless. No one who accompanied but can certify the invaluable assistance rendered by Bloody Knife as guide. Ultimately, during that campaign, there were no further skirmishes with the Sioux. There had been rumors that Sitting Bull was planning an attack, and the accompanying botanist on the trip said, quote, the re-scouts are invaluable, and he credited them with preventing any ambushes on the campaign. The 7th Cavalry and the Arikara Scouts returned to Fort Abraham Lincoln on August 30th. They traveled over 800 miles. But the Black Hills expedition was not without drama. Whatever the real motives may have been, gold had been found in August. The news was telegraphed around to the Eastern press. They reported gold at the grassroots, but there would be blood and devastation there too. The news caused an invasion of gold seekers. The Army posted Army sentries around the Black Hills to try to keep miners out, but up to 15,000 illegal miners crossed into the Sioux Sacred Treaty territory. Then the U.S. government tried to buy the sacred Black Hills, but the Sioux refused. Custer's expedition to the Black Hills created heightened tensions between the U.S. government and the Sioux Nation and paved the way for the summer campaign that would end Custer and so many other lives. In May 1875, the Treaty of Fort Abraham Lincoln was signed by headmen and representatives of the 3 affiliated tribes and the Sioux. Interestingly, the Hunkpapa had the most signers, but of the 6 headmen who signed, Gall was not one of them. This was followed by great feasting and celebration, but once more the peace did not last. In late June 1875, Custer organized yet another peace council between the 3 nations from Fort Berthold and the Sioux from Standing Rock Reservation, bringing together their Indian agents and their chiefs. Once more it seemed as if peace had been agreed on. We don't know what Bloody Knife thought of this, but we can guess he was not happy. A couple of days after the Sioux went back to Standing Rock, Bloody Knife, visibly intoxicated, missed a steamer crossing the river. He started firing shots at the boat until a sergeant on the boat shot back. The Bismarck paper, which more than once referred to Bloody Knife by name, implying he clearly needed no introduction, reported the incident and said, quote, no one was injured. When Bloody Knife ran into his friend later that day, the Civil War veteran, hunter, trapper, and writer Joseph Henry Taylor at Fort Abraham Lincoln, Bloody Knife said, my heart is strong. I fought a steamboat this day. Also during the summer of 1875, a delegation of Arikara and Mandan traveled to Washington, D.C. There they told the Commissioner of Indian Affairs that they would help recruit Indian scouts for the United States Army for any upcoming campaigns against the Sioux, as they too were at war with Sitting Bull. In the autumn of 1875, when Bloody Knife invited the writer Joseph Henry Taylor to accompany him on a hunt, Bloody Knife reported seeing 40 elk a few days' travel away, and Taylor was thrilled to join him, as he had been wanting to interview Bloody Knife and ask about the long and well-known hatred between he and Gall. He managed to get an interview, and that interview is the source of many of our personal anecdotes that we have about Bloody Knife's life. But before Taylor and Bloody Knife arrived at the elk hunting grounds, they met up with 2 other hunters from Bismarck, and these men had found a barrel of wine and offered to share. The next day, when Taylor was ready to head out with his gun, Bloody Knife said, go on ahead without him. He wanted to stay and drink with the hunters. In November 1875, President Grant issued an ultimatum to the hostile or non-treaty Indians, ordering them to report to their agencies before January 31st, 1876, and if they didn't, the United States military would be sent to compel them to do so. Couriers were sent to the various Lakota and Cheyenne winter camps with this news. Gall and his family at the time were living at the Standing Rock Agency. But when he heard this ultimatum, he decided to join his old friend and mentor, Chief Sitting Bull. Gall took with him about 18 to 20 lodges, and he traded in his agency ration card for metal cartridges from the U.S. government licensed trader at Standing Rock. In March 1876, Bloody Knife was invited to join the coming campaign against the Sioux, but not as an enlisted scout earning just $13 a month, but this time as a civilian scout making more than $50 a month, and he would also be provided with an army horse and leather saddle. In 3 months, Bloody Knife and Gall would find themselves on the same battlefield. In April, Custer was in Washington, D.C., testifying before Congress. One of the things Custer brought to the attention of the court was the corruption of the Indian agents and post traders. He said that not only was the promised food not being given to the Indians, but it was being resold to military posts. So the government was paying for these rations twice, while Native Americans starved. Custer testified that 8,000 bushels of corn were brought to Fort Abraham Lincoln, clearly marked as having been set aside to give to Indians, but the trader was trying to sell it to Custer. Custer rejected the corn. The Secretary of War got involved and ordered Custer to receive that corn. Custer said the Lakota at Standing Rock were, quote, living on their ponies and almost in a starving condition. He had even tried to issue army rations to the Sioux, but the Indian Bureau refused to give Custer permission. When Custer returned to Fort Abraham Lincoln, he brought Bloody Knife gifts, a silver medal engraved with his name and a handkerchief decorated with blue stars. Libby Custer wrote, quote, the general studied to bring Bloody Knife something from the East that no other Indian had. She went on to say, Bloody Knife proved himself such an invaluable scout to the general that they often had long interviews. Seated on the grass, the dogs lying about them, they talked over portions of the country that the general had never seen, the scout drawing excellent maps in the sand with a pointed stick. Not long after Custer's return, the 7th Cavalry, with a detachment of 40 Arikara scouts led by Bloody Knife, set out on the campaign that would end for many at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Here's how Libby Custer describes the departure that occurred on May 17th at Fort Abraham Lincoln. The morning for the start came only too soon. The wagons themselves seemed to stretch out interminably. There were pack mules, the ponies already laden, the cavalry, artillery, and infantry followed, the cavalry being in advance of all. The number of men, citizens, employees, Indian scouts, and soldiers was almost 1,200. We were nearly 1,700 animals in all. The 7th Cavalry had been camped outside Fort Lincoln, and they paraded through the post to show the families how ready and powerful they were. That blue circle you see there on the map of Fort Abraham Lincoln, that is the scout quarters, which is where the column entered first. You can imagine Bloody Knife's wife, She-Owl, and their children witnessing his departure, and him in the lead of his scouts. Libby wrote, as we rode at the head of the column, we were the first to enter the garrison. About the Indian quarters stood the women, the old men, and the children, singing a minor tune that has been uttered on the going on and going out of Indian warriors since time immemorial. Some of the women crouched on the ground, too burdened with their troubles to hold up their heads. Others restrained the restless children who, discerning their fathers, sought to follow them. The Indian scouts beat their drums and kept up their particular tune, which is weird and melancholy. Their war song is misnamed as music and more of a lament. The command reached the Powder River Depot in mid-June, and the 7th Cavalry left behind their military band, as well as any new recruits who didn't have horses or anyone deemed unable to continue on the campaign. When Custer was inspecting horses, he noticed an Arikara scout, Howling Wolf, who did not have his horse with him. So Custer asked where the horse was, and Howling Wolf replied, "I put him on an island in the river, so he will be strong for the journey. He is as smooth and without galls as he was when he was a colt." Custer impatiently said, "Bring him here, or I will shoot him." Howling Wolf brought the horse, and Custer said, "See that gall on his back as large as my hand? What do you mean by your story?" And Howling Wolf replied, "It is behind the saddle. He is sound under the saddle. He can out-travel any horse but yours, and should he fall behind, I will keep up with you on foot." Custer laughed and said, "Since you are a wolf, you may go." Now, Major Reno had a similar exchange with an Arikara scout. He told High Bear that he couldn't go with them because his horse was badly galled, and High Bear said, "You see the sun there? If you say it does not move, I will not dispute you," which was the Arikara way of saying someone was wrong. Well, Reno said to the Arikara interpreter, Fred Gerard, "Tell him any man who is not a fool will agree with me without question." And High Bear grew angry and said, "If only one of us is to go on, we will decide by a fight which one is to go. The one killed in the fight will not go on." Reno then threatened to shoot High Bear. High Bear started at him with a knife. That's when Bloody Knife sprang between the two of them and said, "General Custer is my brother, and I forbid this fight." Then Bloody Knife turned to Reno and said, "I wish for my sake you would let him go." So Reno let him go. This might be why the Arikara scouts called Reno Man with a Dark Face, but it illustrates what a good diplomat and the high standing that Bloody Knife must have had for Reno, hot-tempered Reno, to listen to him. The Arikara scouts were joined by a handful of Crow scouts. They were loaned to Custer a few days before the battle by Colonel John Gibbon, who had recruited them from their Montana agency. The Crow Nation had their own problems with the Lakota, as Libby Custer mentions in Boots and Saddles. Sitting Bull refused to make a treaty. Besides his constant attacks on white settlers, he was incessantly invading and stealing land from the peaceable Crows. They appealed for help to the government that had promised to shield them. Now, these were some of the finest scouts working for the United States Army. Bloody Knife and the rest were doing what they did on every other expedition they were involved in. That's why Bloody Knife had been consistently mentioned for more than a decade, that he had been working for the United States Army from Fort Berthold to Fort Buford to Fort Stevenson to Fort Rice to Fort Abraham Lincoln. Bloody Knife was scouting. He was doing what he did best, to track the movements of the enemy. As Little Bighorn scholar George Custer pointed out to me, there is no doubt that Custer was getting the best intelligence available from these scouts, who knew both the lay of the land as well as the enemy, especially once the Crow scouts, whose land they were traveling on now, joined Custer's column. The trail of the combined forces of the Lakota and Cheyenne grew bigger and bigger, and Custer knew a fight was imminent. He gave the Arikara a little pep talk, saying that if they were victorious over the Sioux, Custer would go to Washington, D.C., and he would take Bloody Knife with him, maybe all of them with him. Red Star quoted Custer as saying, "My brother Bloody Knife will return, and when he arrives home, he shall have a fine-looking house built for him, and you will have positions under him, and you will all have plenty to eat for all time to come, you and your children." It is this mentioning of Washington, D.C. by Custer that propagated the myth that he was planning on running for president that we still hear about today. On June 23rd, the Arikara interpreter, Fred Gerard, whose first wife was an Arikara and who had been trading with the Arikara for 25 years, told the scouts that it was time for them to sing their death songs, as the fight would soon be on. Red Star continued, "Custer had a heart like an Indian. If we ever left anything out, one thing in our ceremonies, he would suggest it to us. We got on our horses and rode around, singing the songs. Then we fell behind Custer and marched on. It was on this night that Bloody Knife disappeared after supper. Red Star said. The scouts waited for him till it was later, but he was drunk somewhere. Next morning at breakfast, Bloody Knife appeared, leading a horse. The bugle sounded, and we saddled up. On June 24th, they came to an abandoned Lakota camp and found the remains of a Sundance circle and saw pictures and objects left in the sand as warning. The Sioux Indian scouts in Custer's army said that the drawings were meant that the Sioux knew the army was coming. The Arikara scouts found more drawings in a sweat lodge, drawings of dead men, and the Arikara took these to mean that the Dakota medicine was strong and that the army would be defeated. Later that day, Custer and some officers came into the Arikara camp and asked the scouts if they had heard the Crow reports that there were large camps of Sioux ahead. One young Arikara jumped up and tried to show Custer how to dodge enemy bullets, teasing Custer about how soldiers fought, saying, "You stand in rows erect and do not dodge about, so it is easy to shoot you." Custer laughed and extended his arms and said, "Some of you I see here that have been with me on one or two other expeditions, and to see you again makes my heart glad." And then he told the scouts that his only intention of bringing them was to have them, quote, "go into battle and take many horses from the Sioux." Custer had good reason for wanting the scouts to go after the Lakota ponies. General Sheridan had said, "A Sioux on foot is a Sioux warrior no longer." And General Crook had said, "The Sioux is a cavalry soldier from the time he has intelligence enough to ride a horse or fire a gun." The half-Blackfoot, half-white scout Billy Jackson, in an undated interview, claimed Bloody Knife said on the eve of the fight, "My friends, this big trail proves what we heard, that the Sioux have left their agencies to join Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. It is as I have told Longhair. This gathering of the enemy tribes is too many for us, but he will not believe me. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull are not men without sense. They have their scouts out, and some of them surely have their eyes on us. Well, tomorrow we are going to have a big fight, a losing fight." Here's a Google map, guys, to help us get situated and sort of see the terrain that is about to get covered. The Crow's Nest is down there on the right, that itty-bitty little heart, and then the Little Bighorn battlefield is in the distance, about 16 miles away or so. Early on the morning of that fateful Sunday, June 25th, 1876, 7th Cavalry Officer Edward Godfrey remembered, sometime before 8 a.m., General Custer rode bareback to the several troops and gave the order to be ready to march at 8 o'clock, and gave information that the scouts had discovered the locality of the Indian villages or camps in the valley of the Little Bighorn, about 12 or 15 miles beyond the divide. Just before setting out, I went to where General Custer's bivouac was. The general and Bloody Knife and several scouts and an interpreter were squatted in a circle, having a talk after the Indian fashion. The general wore a serious expression. The scouts were doing the talking and seemed nervous and disturbed. Finally, Bloody Knife made a remark, and Custer asked, "What's that he says?" And the interpreter said, "He says we'll find enough Sioux to keep us fighting 2 or 3 days." The general smiled and remarked, "I guess we'll get through them in 1 day." Then the Crow Scouts brought Custer and the others up to the Crow's Nest, where they pointed out the Indian village in the distance. Custer wanted to wait and attack the Sioux village the next day at dawn. Army experience and Custer's experience in fighting the Lakota and Cheyenne had proven that if the warriors and village packed up and escaped, they'd never be found again. If this happened, the entire summer campaign would be lost. But the Crow, on whose land they were on, urged Custer to attack immediately. The Arikara scout Red Star remembered. Custer said angrily, "I say we have not been seen. I want to wait until it is dark and place our army around the Sioux camp." Big Belly said, "That plan is bad. The Crow scouts insisted that the Dakota had already seen the army and would report its coming, and they would attack Custer's army. The Crow wanted him to attack at once that day and capture the horses of the Dakota and leave them unable to move rapidly. Custer replied, "Yes, it shall be done, as you say." When the group came down from the Crow's Nest, Billy Jackson said, "Mitch Bower described the enemy camp. He said that Longhair had decided to attack the camp, and they would have a terrible fight, that the scouts should take courage, fight hard, make every shot a killer." After a minute or two, Bloody Knife looked up and signed toward the sun, "I shall not see you go down behind the mountains tonight." Here's a map by my friend Jeff Lackey that shows the route Custer's columns took. After riding onward about 8 miles, Red Bear would later recount, "Custer had ordered a charge, and he also gave the orders to take the Dakota horses. The scouts charged down the dry run, and when Red Bear came to a lone teepee, the other scouts were riding around it, striking it with their whips. They stopped there for about a half hour. One called out, 'There is plenty of grub here,' and they drank the soup left for the dead Dakota warrior inside. Then Custer rode up and called out, 'You were supposed to go right on into the Sioux village. I told you to stop for nothing. You have disobeyed me.'" Now, this is when Custer ordered Reno to take as rapid a gait as you think prudent and charge the village afterwards, and you will be supported by the whole outfit. And Reno charged into the valley with the scouts in the lead, including Bloody Knife, who rode ahead. Custer seems to have followed Reno's column almost to the river crossing, but then he diverted his column northward and remained on the east side of the river, to never be seen by Bloody Knife again. Here's another great map by Jeff Lackey. Those red guidon symbols are for the Indian Scouts with Reno, and you can see how they're headed off to the left to the benchland there where the Sioux pony herd was. And you can also see how far ahead of the soldiers the Arikara Scouts were, and Bloody Knife was out front of everyone. Incredibly, the red teepees you see, that's the first village that lay in the path of Reno and the Indian Scouts. And it was the Hunkpapa village, Chief Sitting Bull and Gall's village. The Hunkpapas were arguably some of the most seasoned warriors there that day. And as Reno and his men grew closer to this camp, he realized that instead of everybody running away, there were Sioux indeed coming up to meet him. He called for the soldiers to halt, dismount, and form a skirmish line. The Hunkpapa camp was surprised by this attack. The first who were hit were those outside the camp, including a group of Hunkpapa boys who were playing in the woods just south of the village, as well as some women and children. The Hunkpapa warriors, including Gall, as soon as they heard the soldiers' guns, ran to get their horses. But many of those horses were on that benchland beyond the camp circle. Little Sioux was Bloody Knife's nephew. He remembered his uncle coming up to him with 3 Sioux ponies and then quickly riding off ahead again. Then Little Sioux saw 3 women and 2 children running as fast as they could toward the river. Little Sioux fired at them twice, as did the scout Red Star. A total of 4 Arikara scouts chased them down, riding through the timber to the river, firing away. But then they saw a large Sioux pony herd and peeled off to stampede the horses. After the fight, the interpreter and scout George Custer found 6 Lakota women and 4 children in a small ravine near the valley fight, and he said they had been killed by the Arikara scouts. Now when Gall returned on horseback, he looked for his family. He said he found 2 wives and 3 children dead near the timber south of the Hunkpapa camp. If Gall's family were indeed killed by the scouts, that's some strange eye for an eye balance of the universe, as Bloody Knife blamed Gall for killing multiple members of his family, as we discussed in part 1. Gall said finding the bodies of his wives and children made his heart bad. After that, I killed all my enemies with the hatchet. The Arikara scout Young Hawk saw Bloody Knife soon arrive at the soldier skirmish line. He came right toward me, and I looked up and noticed his dress. He had on the black handkerchief with blue stars, given him by Custer. He wore a bear's claw with a clamshell on it. Bloody Knife then spoke to Young Hawk, saying, "What Custer has ordered about the Sioux horses is being done. The horses are being taken away." Soon the soldier skirmish line broke up, and the men entered the shelter of a nearby timber. Reno was in the small clearing in this timber, trying to decide what to do next, afraid that the Sioux were getting around them on all sides. Bloody Knife, who was used to being by the side of the commander, was next to Reno. Reno turned to Bloody Knife to ask what he thought the Sioux would do next, when suddenly shots crashed through the trees. One private was shot through the back of the neck, the bullet coming out his mouth. Then a bullet hit Bloody Knife in the head, and Reno, just a few feet away, was splashed with the blood and brain matter of the famed Arikara scout. According to George Herendeen, it was the death of Bloody Knife that unnerved Reno to the degree that he suddenly gave contradictory orders, shouting, "Mount!" and then "Dismount!" and then "Mount again," and then riding out of the timber in utter disarray. Reno's column then retreated up the bluffs to a hill that now bears his name. George Custer and his column meanwhile moved around to flank the massive village complex. Custer waited for Reno and Benteen to join him, but they were unable to unite the entire command on the battlefield, and they returned to Reno Hill, where they remained besieged for another day. 2 other Arikara scouts who had been with Reno were killed, as well as Bloody Knife. One was Bobtailed Bull, the sergeant of the Indian Scouts. Bobtailed Bull was 45 years old. The third Arikara to fall was the 27-year-old Little Brave. Within a few hours, George Custer and the men with him were killed to the last man. The Sioux and Cheyenne won an astounding victory over the United States Army that day. But the story of Bloody Knife does not entirely end there. There are a few tales about what happened to his body. Some say that after the fight, 2 Hunkpapa girls found his body and cut off his head, bringing it into the village either by swinging it between them from his hair or holding it up on a pike. When their mother found them, she recognized the head and screamed. The mother was Bloody Knife's sister, also half Arikara and half Hunkpapa, who had stayed with the Hunkpapas. Interestingly, Bloody Knife's sister thought that it was the warrior Gall who had shot her brother dead in the timber. Gall's exact role at the Little Bighorn is unknown, but after finding the bodies of his family, who Bloody Knife may have had a hand in killing, it is often thought that Gall broke the defense in Captain Keogh's sector of the Custer fight, contributing to the collapse that ended at Last Stand Hill. On the night of June 25th, Gall would not participate in any of the celebrations occurring in the victorious camps. He was grieving the death of his wives and children. But then Bloody Knife's decapitated head was brought to him. Supposedly, at the sight of this, the Hunkpapa warrior smiled and said, "Now that my vilest enemy is dead, I can join you in the dance." After the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Gall and his people fled to Canada. However, he eventually broke with Chief Sitting Bull when Sitting Bull would not surrender to the U.S. government. Gall, on the other hand, returned to the States with his band in 1881. He remained a charismatic leader at the Standing Rock Agency, even as he chose to walk the white man's road. He was a trusted ally of Indian agent James McLaughlin, who was himself married to a Sioux woman. Gall embraced assimilation, becoming a district farmer and serving as a judge. He advocated Sioux children being educated by the whites, so much so that he moved his entire band and started farming near St. Elizabeth Episcopal Mission so that his children could attend the school there. But he steadfastly fought the Sioux Act of the late 1880s that reduced the size of the Great Sioux Reservation and opened it up to white settlers. During the Ghost Dance uprisings, Gall requested guns from the United States government to help protect his band from what he considered too zealous ghost dancers. A few years before his death, in late 1894, Gall converted to Christianity, and he was baptized, married, and buried by the Episcopal Church. Today, Bloody Knife is remembered where he fell, where the Battle of the Little Bighorn began in the valley, with this marker. He also has a marker at the Indian Scout Cemetery at the Fort Berthold Reservation, and there's a memorial celebrating his life in the process of being built. After his death, his wife, She-Owl, tried to collect the money the United States government owed her husband. In 1881, she received a payment of $91.66, which equals about $2,700 today. She bore him at least 3 children, and their lives ended in tragedy. The baby girl died in 1869 and was buried at Fort Buford. One son was killed in the Lakota fight with the Arikara before the Black Hills expedition. And one son, known as Stays Overnight in Arikara and Milton Fowler in English, was murdered by his wife in 1904. But the Arikara remember him with a song called Bloody Knife's War Song, and they also maintain a proud tradition of serving with honor in the United States military. As the frontiersman and writer Joseph Henry Taylor wrote, Bloody Knife was an excellent guide, a true blue scout. No officer of the army with whom he served ever charged him with disloyalty, whatever the provocation, nor of shirking any duty, however hazardous.
As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, leave me a comment. Tell me if you have any suggestions for future videos or just say hello. Oh, credits are coming up next, and I have a massive book list because I used a lot of materials putting together this very long Bloody Knife biography. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Hope to hear from y'all soon. Bye.